In the deadly winter of 1884, Jack Ryland returned to his lonely homestead to find his wife Emma gone, and a forged note claiming she'd abandoned him. But Jack knew the truth was buried in the snow. For 3 long years he hunted the brutal gang who stole her, pushing through blizzards, mountain passes, and frozen trails, watched till the end to uncover Jack's brutal, ice-cold path of vengeance against the Frost Reavers, and how love survived when the winter tried to kill it. Tell us where you're watching from, partner. Join our Sleep West family, and now let's dive deep into the story.
The year was 1884, and the Bitterroot territory was locked in the icy grip of a relentless winter. The air was a crystalline dagger, and the landscape, stretching from the frozen peaks of the Sentinel Range to the valley floor, was buried beneath a treacherous mantle of snow. In this desolate cold, Jack Ryland and his newlywed wife, Emma, had carved out a fragile warmth on their isolated homestead near the outpost of Iron Creek. Jack, a man of stoic reserve and immense strength, loved the challenge of the winter, but it also meant isolation and vulnerability. One morning, when the thermometer plunged well below freezing, Jack had to ride out to secure their small herd of horses who were struggling against a rapidly deepening drift. He promised Emma he would be back before the afternoon snowfall intensified. The solitude of the ranch was violently invaded by 4 ruthless bandits known across the territory as the Frost Reavers. They were led by a towering man named Bode, whose cruelty was as legendary as the depth of the winter. Emma, always practical and resilient, fought back, but the men overpowered her in the confined space of the cabin. To hide their crime, Bode ensured the scene suggested Emma had fled, desperate for warmer climes. They forced her to write a letter, chilled and shaking, claiming she was exhausted by the frontier life and had slipped away under the cover of the fresh snow. They dragged her outside, forcing her to walk for miles before lifting her onto a horse, ensuring her footprints led only to a dead end near the river. Jack returned as dusk settled, the wind howling a mournful sound through the valley. He noticed the disturbed snow near the woodshed, the tracks too heavy for Emma's boots. Inside, the cabin was eerily quiet. The scent of wood smoke mingled with the unnatural chill of the open back door. He found the note pinned to the mantel with a rusty spike. "Jack, I'm sorry. I couldn't face another season here. I'm heading south. Please forget me." Jack read the stiff, unfamiliar handwriting. Emma would never write that way. She was a woman who faced blizzards and bears with equal disdain. The note was a fabrication, a crude lie meant to stop him from looking. He recognized the brutal hand of men. The snow, falling heavily now, was already erasing the tracks, but Jack's resolve was etched in steel. He felt no immediate panic or tears, only a terrifying, bone-deep certainty. They had taken her, and the winter was their accomplice. For 3 years, Jack was a shadow in the high country. The winter became his season of vengeance. He traded his rancher's ease for the life of a relentless tracker, following faint, half-frozen trails across the Bitterroot. He endured months of frozen isolation, speaking only to his horse and the wind. Every cold morning was a renewed oath to find his wife. He chased rumors of the Frost Reavers, learning their names: Bode, Gus, Caleb, and Fletcher, and their territories, which stretched from the desolate mining camps to the frigid trading posts. In the late autumn of the 3rd year, Jack found himself in the ramshackle town of Tanglewood Pass, a temporary trading hub before the heavy snows sealed off the main trails. He was leaning against a post, his face obscured by a thick, ice-rimmed scarf, his eyes scanning the crowd with perpetual suspicion. A small, bundled figure, muffled in a threadbare coat, stumbled through the slushy mud and ice. It was a girl, perhaps 3 years old, with huge, sorrowful eyes and dark, wind-whipped hair. She looked up at him, her lips blue with cold, and her voice barely a whisper against the wind. "Mister, could you buy us, please?" she pleaded, pointing a tiny gloved hand toward a crowd gathered near a makeshift stage. Jack followed her gaze. Standing exposed on the wooden platform, shivering uncontrollably, was a woman. Her wrists were tied with a rope loop that was stiff with frost. A hood and a shawl obscured her face, which was bowed against the relentless wind. She stood utterly motionless, a portrait of profound defeat. Jack's heart, which he thought had turned to ice, pulsed with a terrible, unfamiliar warmth. The auctioneer, A corpulent man bundled in a thick fur coat was shouting into the wind, his breath freezing in plumes. Lot 12, property of the late Mr. Thorne. A fine, sturdy woman, gentlemen. Starting bid $10. A drunken miner scoffed, pulling his heavy jacket tighter. $10? For a chattel that needs constant feeding in this weather. She'll be dead by New Year's. I'll give $5, and that's generous for the winter upkeep. A wave of cruel laughter rippled through the frozen crowd. The sheer, staggering contempt shown to the woman on the block ignited Jack's long-dormant rage. He pushed through the crowd, his heavy coat sweeping aside bystanders. His voice, strained from years of disuse, was now a loud, clear challenge that cut through the frozen air. $20. The miner spun around, insulted. 20? Ryland, you fool. She's a liability. 25, shouted a stockman, trying to stay in the game. Jack never looked at them. His eyes were fixed on the auctioneer, and his hand hovered near the ivory grip of his revolver. $30. And I want the bill of sale signed now. The atmosphere shifted. The auctioneer, sensing the danger in Jack's demeanor, the cold purpose in his eyes, did not hesitate. $30. Sold. To the gentleman. Jack slapped the money down, took the rope from the auctioneer, and led the woman and the little girl away from the crowd. He cut the frozen rope loops from her wrists with his hunting knife. They rode through the gathering storm for hours. The winter's early darkness fell, and the wind began to roar, signaling a full blizzard. Jack steered them toward a small, isolated trapper's lean-to he knew, nestled deep within a stand of pines. Inside the small shelter, Jack quickly set a fire, feeding it dry, cracked pine logs. He wrapped the woman in a heavy, scratchy wool blanket. He handed the little girl a piece of salted beef, which she devoured ravenously. Jack stood near the fire, giving her space to recover, but the anxiety was a knot in his stomach. He had to know who she was. "We are safe here," he said, his voice low and devoid of judgment. "You are free. Now please, warm yourself, and let me see your face." Slowly, hesitantly, the woman turned toward the flickering firelight. Her hands, stiff with cold, reached up and brushed away the heavy snow-matted hair that had hidden her. Jack Ryland stared, and the breath froze in his throat. The face was gaunt, scarred by hardship, but the eyes, the determined, sharp, hazel eyes, were unmistakable. He uttered the name, not as a question, but as a devastating, certain declaration. Emma. Hearing the intimate sound of her name, spoken by the voice she had mourned for 3 years, Emma's strength finally abandoned her. A wave of exhaustion, fear, and shock overwhelmed her, and she crumpled to the floor. Jack was instantly beside her, catching her head before it struck the icy earth, holding her against his chest. He carried her to the softest spot in the lean-to, and covered her again. The little girl, Sarah, watched him with wide, solemn eyes.
Jack remained calm, focused. He gave Emma water, waiting for her to come back to her senses. When she did, he continued his vigil, providing food and warmth, demanding nothing. He knew the story would come when she was ready. 2 days later, the blizzard had passed, leaving behind a world sparkling with dangerous ice and deep silence. 3 riders approached the lean-to. Bode, the leader of the Frost Reavers, and 2 of his men. They had tracked the auctioneer and learned Jack was the purchaser. Bode stood outside the shelter, framed by the blinding snow, his voice a cold snarl. "Ryland, you bought what was already ours. The woman is my property, acquired fairly. No one sells my goods without my signature. Hand her over, and we ride out peacefully." Jack stepped out, his tall frame dwarfing the entrance. He didn't even shiver in the biting cold. "She is my wife, she is family, and the child is mine." The brutal men exchanged mocking glances, their arrogance palpable. Bode sneered. "Don't be a fool. You're alone. We're 4, 3. Jack corrected him, his eyes hard. "You left your dog Gus to die of his wounds after our last meeting. A small lie, but a necessary deterrent. Now I will not warn you twice. Leave and you might live." Bode's smile vanished. "Hand her over, or you die alone in this hole." Jack drew his revolver, the gleaming steel a stark contrast to the white snow. He didn't waste time with warnings. He fired, not at Bode's heart, but at the thigh of the man closest to him, a ruffian named Caleb. Crack! The sound echoed like a cannon in the cold silence. Caleb screamed, dropping his rifle and falling into the snowdrift,
clutching his shattered leg. "My aim is precise," Jack said, the barrel of his gun smoking slightly in the freezing air. "I'm telling you one last time. Ride now. The next bullet goes into your brain, Bode. Your choice." Bode stared at the ferocious, unyielding man before him. He saw not a defeated rancher, but a coiled spring of vengeance. He cursed, ordered his remaining man to haul the wounded Caleb onto a horse, and retreated, his confidence wounded. As the three men rode away, scrambling to manage their wounded companion, Bode looked back, his face a mask of thwarted fury and icy menace. He shouted back a chilling promise over the wind. "You've earned yourself a long, cold death, Ryland. This peace won't last. We'll be back to collect what's mine." His words were swallowed by the vast hostile whiteness, yet the threat lingered like the smell of gunpowder. Jack simply watched them go, reloading his revolver with methodical, silent precision, every click of the cylinder a promise of future retribution. Inside the precarious safety of the lean-to, Emma was still wrapped tightly in the wool blanket, clutching the small, precious hand of Sarah. The encounter with the men had shaken her, but it also served to shatter the last vestiges of her enforced silence. Finally, sitting by the meager, sputtering fire, Emma began to pour out the horrifying 3-year narrative of her torment. The kidnapping, she recounted, was a brutal violation of their home, the 4 men overwhelming her with savage efficiency. The planted note was their final cruel act, meant to convince Jack she was a faithless coward, shattering his heart while ensuring the law wouldn't look for a crime. She detailed the subsequent sale into brutal slavery to Mr. Thorne, a monstrous rancher whose isolation only amplified his cruelty, and who viewed her as less than a beast of burden. She spoke of the relentless labor, the constant fear, and the daily beatings that left her body scarred and her spirit nearly broken. Then came the terrible truth of the birth of Sarah, a child conceived in violence, but who had become her one desperate lifeline to hope. Emma explained how Thorne's sudden violent death in a saloon brawl had temporarily freed her, yet his creditors immediately seized his assets. This tragic reprieve had only led to the auction block, where she was to be sold again to the highest bidder, exposed and humiliated, which was precisely where Jack had found them. She cried silently as she finished, the tears freezing slightly on her cheeks. Jack listened, his entire body rigid, his jaw locked so tightly his teeth ached. He didn't interrupt, allowing the agonizing truth to wash over him, sealing his purpose. The failure of the distant law, the indifference of the few territorial rangers, and the complicity of local officials, many of whom were bribed or too frightened of the Frost Reavers, was devastatingly clear. He realized the established order would never deliver justice for Emma. The time for waiting and hoping was over. The winter of his vengeance had begun. He moved to Emma and Sarah, holding them close, infusing them with the last of his warmth and protection. He kissed Emma and Sarah goodbye, a deep, solemn farewell, promising to return when the air was clean, when the men who had stolen her life were gone forever. He knew he was leaving his life of decency behind for the shadowed path of the vigilante, but he accepted the cost. The pursuit was an agonizing trial in the deep winter. The heavy snow obscured trails, the wind scoured the high passes, and every night was a battle against the killing cold. Jack moved with the silent predatory efficiency of a wolf. His first target was Fletcher, the youngest and most careless of the group. Jack tracked him to a frozen mining town, a collection of desperate shacks clinging to a hillside. He located Fletcher at a ramshackle claim, ambushing him near a slag heap where the man was alone, trying to chip ore from the frozen ground. The confrontation was quick and brutal, the only sound the crunch of frozen earth. Jack ensured Fletcher's body was buried deep under a fresh snowfall, erasing the evidence of the swift justice he had dealt. He left no witness, only silence. Gus, who was indeed recovering from a non-fatal injury, a bullet graze he sustained during the initial kidnapping, Jack now realized, was his next target. Gus was hiding at a hidden cabin deep in the foothills. Jack located the isolated shack just as a brutal winter storm descended, muffling the world in thick, whirling flakes. He surprised Gus, finding the man armed but unprepared for the ghost that had arrived. Jack finished the job with ruthless finality, turning the isolated shack into a tomb of ice and pine. sealing Gus's fate with the relentless fury of the blizzard. Caleb, the man Jack had shot in the thigh, was next. Hobbled and fleeing after the shooting, Jack tracked him by the pathetic smears of blood on the pristine snow. He found Caleb already overtaken by the elements, his body frozen to death in a mountain pass high above the tree line. Jack simply checked to ensure life was truly gone, a mercy of the cold, and merely ensured he wouldn't be found until spring, his body a grim warning to any who might follow. Finally Bode, the architect of Emma's suffering and the last surviving member, now alone and frantic, became Jack's sole focus. Bode, desperate and cornered, tried to escape over the high mountain pass, recklessly gambling on the severity of the weather to slow Jack down. Jack followed him, moving with grim determination, a man possessed. He tracked him for days across the high, icy landscape, enduring frostbite and starvation, refusing to rest until he saw the final plume of smoke from Bode's temporary camp. The final confrontation took place in a silent snow-choked canyon, a desolate arena where the only witnesses were the towering frozen rock walls. Bode was savage and desperate, fighting with the blind fury of a trapped animal, but Jack was fueled by 3 years of righteous hatred and the fresh memory of Emma's tears. Jack's final shots rang out, deafening in the enclosed space, echoing off the frozen walls, shattering the silence, and bringing a definitive, cold end to the frost reavers. Jack returned to Emma and Sarah, riding into the rising sun of a new, calmer day. The wind seemed to soften, and the bitter cold seemed to ease as he embraced them. He was leaner, harder, and bore the scars of a war fought outside the law, but he was theirs. They left the territory of ice and ghosts, selling the remaining claim for a pittance, seeking a new life in the milder, burgeoning lands of the Pacific coast. They were scarred, but whole, their bond forged in the deepest adversity. The terrible winter their witness, spending the rest of their days together in a quiet, hard-earned peace, a sanctuary far from the mountains, where the only danger was the occasional sea breeze, and the ghost Jack would carry forever.